وين؟ شو؟
I'm looking for more footage, people. Don't worry. Hang in there. Okay, guys, breaking news coming in. Okay, world news is just now reporting Israel's military is conducting precise strikes on military targets in Iran. Statement was announced Saturday local time, early Saturday local time, after reports emerged of explosions heard in Tehran. We have a live Tehran cam that we're streaming for anybody that wants to actually see if anything is going to be going on. We're going to keep you up to date on all the live news and coverage.
Choosing the right candidate for any office is difficult, whether the office is square or even oval. But ZipRecruiter finds quality candidates for your office fast. If only every decision could be this easy.
Breaking news, we are just learning of several explosions in Tehran, according to Iranian state media. Of course, Iran has been bracing now for about a month for a strike from Israel after Iran
expected to be significantly behind schedule, having only left Texas in the last hour or so. He was supposed to start speaking about 45 minutes ago here. There are still several thousand people here in northern Michigan, but this issue has been a real personal one for people, especially in the Detroit area and towns like Dearborn, Hamtramck, where there are significant numbers of Arab and Muslim Americans who are voters who've been in great anguish over the past year over what exactly to do, knowing that it was the Biden administration that stands by Israel and has allowed all this violence to continue, but also knowing that Donald Trump potentially is a personally dangerous choice for them, given policies he put in place when he was president and things he's threatened to do in the years since. Let me pass along one bit of White House news, since that's part of what this correspondent does.
Please.
We are told the president has been briefed on the situation in Israel, has been kept apprised of the details throughout the afternoon and this evening. He is now back at his home in Delaware, having been in Arizona earlier today for an event. Arrived home in Wilmington just a few minutes after Israel confirmed that it had conducted these military operations in Iran. The Secretary of State landed at Joint Base Andrews just moments after the strike was confirmed by Israel. He's back from meetings in the Middle East and in London earlier today with his counterparts about what to do exactly in response to all of this. And as we've reported through sources of Margaret Brennan's and Charlie D'Agata's and Ellie Watson's over at the Pentagon, the U.S. has been kept, of course, surprised of all this in the lead-up and had been working to delay and to sort of specify the response and ensure that it didn't necessarily hit Iranian nuclear targets or places related to its nuclear program, but perhaps the more specific military ones. But this will be an issue out here on the campaign trail in the coming days. Trump is here tonight and tomorrow. Vice President Harris is coming here to Michigan tomorrow because the Wolverine state starts voting early tomorrow. And there's real concern among Democrats that they may not be able to put together the right mix of voter to win this state again. And it usually requires traditional Democratic voters, union households in this state, African Americans, suburban types that are inclined to vote for Democrats. And yes, in and around Detroit and Dearborn and Hamtramck and other communities in Michigan, the Arab and Muslim voters who have traditionally voted for them, who are either withholding support, some might be voting for Trump instead, or voting for third-party candidates. We had a conversation last night with a handful that we'll be sharing through the weekend and into next week. Personally quite anguished about all of this, and yet knowing that they should be doing something. They should be voting and expressing their opinion, either to punish Harris or to stick it to her by voting for Trump, by not voting at all, or potentially voting for someone else. And it will be an issue in this state's Senate race, one of the more competitive ones. The Democrat Alyssa Slotkin running against the Republican Mike Rogers. It's been an issue for them as well for the same reason, that there's such an influential block of voters that can swing elections in this state and who will be watching this over the weekend now, quite concerned again about members of their own community and their families in the region and the potential for widespread violence.
And we do know that there is a razor-thin margin for the House, the Senate, and the White House itself. Right. So all of this is going to have major implications. And let's stick with the White House for just another moment. We have a statement from the National Security Council. It doesn't say much.
Whoever can listen to that shit must have shit in their brains.
Find out how much you could save with Endurance.
Call right now to get $300 off any plan.
Call 1-833-440-3882 now.
And we will put, and that's true, the same position and worse, but they don't want to talk about it. It's out of control. And we have a lot of towns that haven't yet been infected, but they're petrified that they will be, and they will be. And we will put the vicious and bloodthirsty criminals in jail or kick them the hell out of the country so fast.
It's exactly what needs to be done. Joining us now is the host of the Leventhal Report, Rick Leventhal. Rick, thanks for joining this evening, my brother. What are your thoughts on the fact that President Trump is actually willing to say and show and tell the country how he'll handle these illegals that have invaded our country and are just dismantling and wreaking havoc, so many of them, all over the country? What are your thoughts?
Imagine that, a presidential candidate who's actually willing to say how they really feel and willing to say what they're really going to do if and when they win the White House. Kamala Harris is scared to answer a single question with a straight answer, and it's been so frustrating for all of us, David, over the last few months. Now Donald Trump is out front, and it's right where he should be, because he is the only one of the two candidates who's actually giving real policies and giving real answers to real questions and putting himself out there. Harris's behavior and her performances have been embarrassing. They were ripping her on CNN today after her disastrous town hall. And it's kind of pathetic, the fact that she hasn't held a news conference since she was ordained the Democratic nominee. It's been something like 96 days, not a single news conference. And good for Donald Trump for standing up for the American people, for tax-paying U.S. citizens who have been inundated with these waves of illegals who are taking over schools and hospitals and hotels who we're paying for, who are then turning around and robbing and raping and killing American citizens.
Yeah, it's absolutely disturbing and disgusting. A good friend of mine has a job where he works with a lot of law enforcement. He was actually at an international chiefs association of some kind, and he actually got to talk to two very high up people in the Aurora, Colorado Police Department. And he said that the laws there, similar to California, where if somebody's stealing $1,000 or less from a store, they just basically get off with a ticket. And these stores are being, they're being told, you can call the cops and report it, but we're not going to send anybody out there. Now multiply that on to 100 of those that may take place in a day or in a weekend. The stores could lose $100,000 in a weekend and can't do a darn thing about it. And that's pretty much what the Democrats want. It's what happens in California. I'm pretty sure she'd probably try to make it the same around the country. And yet this woman is a heartbeat away from the presidency. Rick, how in the world did the Democrats allow themselves to get stuck with a choice like Kamala Harris for commander-in-chief?
I don't know. I don't know how they wound up with her. She didn't earn it. But they are stuck with her now. And, you reminded me of a story we did, that was about 2 months ago out of Chicago, where some guy had been arrested something like 15 times for one theft after another theft, for stealing stuff out of stores and getting caught and getting released and getting caught again and getting released. And what is the ultimate result of that kind of chronic theft? Well, guess what? Prices go up. They start locking all the goods behind, plastic walls, and then you got to get a store employee to come over and open it for you, but there are no store employees to be found, and a simple shopping trip takes 15 minutes, and the goods are 2 and 3 times as much as they used to be because the stores have to make it up somehow. It's so aggravating and so ridiculous to allow people to commit crimes and not punish them. What do you think's going to happen when someone finds out that they can steal up to a certain amount without consequence? They're going to keep stealing. They're going to keep going out and doing it, and that's what's happening. Without punishment, you will have more and more crime, and we're seeing it across America. Yeah. It's awful, and I'm sorry, David, but I hope that people are waking up and seeing it, and maybe that's why the polls are starting to reflect Trump with a lead.
Yeah, well, and they need to understand, too, that it's vote early. We've got to vote early in every single state around this country. That's what's going to be the Achilles heel of any shenanigans that the Democrats may have up their sleeves. Let's watch another clip from President Trump's rally last night in which he argues that illegal immigration is being used as a weapon against us, the American people.
You're witnessing the economic oppression of Americans to reward and enrich illegal aliens. But all that stops 2 weeks from now. Think of it, 2 weeks. Less than 2 weeks. For 4 straight years, Kamala Harris has imported an army of illegal alien gang members and migrant criminals from prisons and jails, insane asylums and mental institutions all over the world, from Venezuela to the Congo in Africa, and she's resettled them into a community near you. Isn't that lovely? And really did it, and they will prey on innocent Americans that have no idea what we're getting into. When we win on November 5th, the migrant invasion ends and the restoration of our country begins.
Yeah, it's way past time. Kamala Harris, as the borders are, has allowed it. I remember Tucker talking about it 3 years ago. He said this is why they're going to open the border. This is why they're going to allow mass invasion of illegal aliens, because they'll want to get them in here, sprinkle them around the country, and then get them the ability to vote. My concern, let me ask you this, Rick, if you thought of this. One of my concerns is we're also focused on the swing states. How possible is it that there could be some shenanigans taking place in a state that should be solid red, and they actually flip it and turn it blue and get those delegates? What kind of likelihood do you see of something like that taking place?
I hope that doesn't happen, David. I know there are a lot of eyeballs this time around on polling places, and both sides are making sure, or trying to make sure, that that sort of thing doesn't happen. I'd be more concerned with the mail-in ballots than anything else. But listen, all that matters is more people cast ballots for one candidate than the other to ensure that that one candidate wins. And I think Donald Trump often says at his rallies, that we're going to win big. We need to win big. Too big to rig. I think
what
is
we
what
got to
he
make
says.
happen. Yep.
Yeah. So that
exactly
I think
what we
that's
got to
the key.
do.
This whole, we talk about the border all the time on my show, and I know you do on your show too. Fences work, walls work. Even if they manage to climb over it from place to place, time to time, you're deterring them. Israel has very secure borders because of the walls around that country. There are a lot of examples. The White House has a fence around it. The country should have a fence around it. That's important. And then, when someone earns the right to come into America, that you let them in. But you can't just let everyone in without seeing who they are and where they're from and what jail they just got out of. I mean, these things matter. And we're now suffering the consequences of them not doing their due diligence.
Yeah, it's exactly what we're suffering. I know that President Trump, on one of his recent rallies, he actually had the mom of Jocelyn Nungary up there to speak, and she shared how she'd heard from President Trump on multiple occasions. Again, her daughter, 12 years old, was lured by 2 illegals down to a riverbank, was horribly abused, raped, and then murdered, and then tossed like garbage by the river. Kamala hadn't reached out until apparently just recently tried to in some manner. Jocelyn's mom, Alexis, she said she didn't take it very genuine It seemed more that she was doing it just because the election is right around the corner. But then what could the border czar say about illegals coming in and raping and murdering this 12-year-old girl? What could she actually say to the mother? It's just disgraceful. Rick, before we let you go, we just heard that Israel launched a retaliatory strike on Iran tonight, and we're still waiting on more facts about that. But what are your thoughts on this situation?
Well, we've been trying to keep up with the breaking news out of the Middle East. It's close to 4 a.m. now in Tehran, which is under attack apparently by the Israelis. You know, Iran fired a couple of barrages of missiles at Israel, sort of a back and forth because of the situation in Israel. Of course, it started with that attack on October 7th more than a year ago, one of the worst in the history of the Jewish state. And since then, as Israel's been attacking Hamas and Hezbollah and other proxies of Iran have been striking back at Israel. And after Israel took out a Hezbollah commander, Iran fired missiles on October 1st at Israel. And Israel has been vowing to strike back, and it is striking back at this hour. We don't know what it's hit, exactly what the targets are. Israel says they are Iranian military targets, but there have been numerous explosions reported in and around the capital city of Tehran in Iran. And we're just waiting for more information on what exactly has been hit and how extensive the damages are, David.
This is, I mean, this should be very concerning to us as Americans because, you know, who has Iran's back? China. Who has China's back? Russia. Is this, I mean, we're teetering literally on the brink of World War III here. And honestly, World War III or a mass escalation in this war, that could have an effect on the election as well. What are your thoughts in that scenario?
Well, I'll tell you this. What we haven't heard from the Biden and Harris administration is release the hostages immediately. Hamas has to release the hostages. They should have been saying that from day one and insisting before any negotiations take place that Hamas release the hundreds of hostages it brought back into Gaza with them after they slaughtered some 1,200 Israelis. And instead of doing that, the administration in the U.S. kept putting pressure on Israel, or trying to find a way to stop the war and make peace with Hamas, which was still holding a couple of hundred hostages in tunnels and doing awful, awful things to those people. And they're still holding close to 100 hostages. Hamas is. So where is the U.S., where are the rest of the people of America and around the world? Where's the outrage against the Palestinians, against Hamas for holding hostages for more than a year now? Of course, Israel has a right to defend itself. And of course, Israel has a right to go after the people who murdered their people and are holding the others hostage. And that's what they've been doing. And if the administration had Israel's back from day one and put more pressure on, you know, Hezbollah and Hamas and Iran, then maybe we wouldn't be here right now. Maybe Hamas would have eventually given them up and we would have found peace. But instead, they've been trying to coddle both sides and going hard against the Israelis and sort of fostering this anti-Semitism around the world. And now here we are. And who knows where this is going to head, but it certainly doesn't look good.
No, it doesn't look good at all. And one thing's for sure, it's the weakness in the current administration, which includes Kamala, because Joe's not running anything. It's the weakness that's fostering all of this. And that's why Americans better pray for peace in the Middle East. Rick Leventhal, my brother, appreciate you, man. Love your show. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you, David. Thank you.
Coming up, Elon Musk is on the campaign trail for President Trump. We'll watch how one of the world's, actually he is the world's richest man, is doing everything that he can to save America. Next.
Your fault and you don't have an attorney? Listen up. We have legal professionals standing by to answer your questions and tell you what your case is potentially worth. Pick up the phone, call now.
When Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, fell on the 30th of April 1975, America's long conflict there may have ended, but it took decades for the nation to heal its wounds. In 1973, President Nixon orchestrated the Paris Peace Accords, bringing to an end America's involvement in the Vietnam War. America's POWs returned home and all seemed well until March of 1975, when Senator Ted Kennedy led Congress in cutting off all aid to South Vietnam. Within weeks, communist North Vietnam reneged on the peace accords and invaded their neighbors to the south. Without U.S. support, South Vietnam fell to the communists, and throughout South Vietnam, a bloodbath ensued as hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese who had backed the U.S. were massacred. Empowered by the events in Vietnam, communists in Laos and Cambodia soon toppled their pro-Western regimes, and Southeast Asia became a killing field with the genocide of an additional 2 million people. You're watching An American Moment on Newsmax TV.
This right here is confidence in a bottle.
Not only does it change you on the outside, but something in the inside, knowing that you're looking better.
It makes me feel so much more confident than I've ever felt in my life.
They are some of the hottest videos on social media. Those videos claiming to instantly get rid of bags under your eyes. Well, today we're going to see one for ourselves and let you be the judge. It's called Plexiderm, and lifestyle expert Annette Figueroa is here to tell us why she says this one is for real.
This one is for real, and I'm so excited. We even have a video, and you'll notice the model has bags underneath his eyes and some sagging, and all he uses is a small amount on a clean, dry face, and that's how easy it is.
All right, what's the active ingredient?
Okay, so it's silicates that are minerals found in shale rock, and what it does is it tightens and lifts the appearance of bags underneath your eyes in as little as 10 minutes, no prescriptions, and very little effort. Even watching the video, this is a real, it's a model, but it's a real guy with real bags underneath his eyes.
My real true opinion is wholly words I can't say on camera. This is absolutely unbelievable. I mean, I could feel it just lifting my skin. It was amazing. It feels good. Feels great. Looks even better.
And I did this to my father. We were at home, so we applied it to his under eye bags, and let me tell you, we were so excited. In under 10 minutes, they visibly disappeared from view, and now it is literally part of both of our daily routines. He calls me every single month saying, "Hey, Annette, I'm out of Plexiderm, please send me more." And not only does it work on the bags, it works on the appearance of crow's feet, fine lines, and wrinkles. The way you want to do it is you want to have a clean, dry face. You use a small amount because it's so powerful. You have high school reunions, you have events you want to go to, you want to look years younger, this is it.
At our $14.95 price, it's the best way to try Plexiderm and see it work for yourself after your first application. Call the number on your screen.
Call 800-531-2824.
Good evening, friends, and welcome back to The Pulse. I am David Harris Jr. Well, Elon Musk, he's holding town halls in Pennsylvania to promote the MAGA agenda and share his common sense wisdom with voters. If you're wondering why the world's richest man would upend his life and get into politics, well, here he is explaining it himself.
You know, I build rockets and cars and stuff. So what am I doing in politics? It's not, I don't want to be in politics. I want to be clear. That is not my preference. I just like building stuff. I like building products that people love. And I derive joy from seeing people enjoy the products that my companies make. So I like making products people love, and that's what I normally like doing, and I actually don't like politics at all. I hate politics. but the stakes are so high here that I have had no choice but to take a stand. So it's not something I want to do, and yeah. Yeah.
The stakes are so high that the world's richest man that likes creating things, likes building things, is willing to step out of the private sector and onto the public, very public stage to show his support for probably one of the most, I'd say courageous, but also one of the most influential, yes, but also the most attacked men in America. That's risky business right there. That's risky for anyone's business. And the lawfare that's been waged even at Elon Musk from so many different departments that want to dive into how his hiring practices and whether he's hiring enough individuals from a certain demographic. Are you freaking kidding me? The stakes are so high that even Elon Musk is willing to put himself out there and his companies out there to try to save America. Last year, Elon Musk took a huge risk in buying and freeing the Twitter platform from the Democrat goons. In this video, he explains why diverse viewpoints are also so important for a healthy society. Check this out.
I think we should embrace a diversity of views, and we should have reasonable arguments, and we should have debates, and they should be, that's the essence of free speech, is that ideas survive, when they're competing ideas in the marketplace of ideas. If somebody says something that's incorrect, then that can be corrected. That's what happens on the X platform. People will say something, then others will add context to it, or they will correct it, or there'll be a community note. And this applies equally to the left and right. There's no thumb on the scale like there used to be. And it's, there's no voice on the left that's been silenced, unlike in the past where many voices on the right were silenced. But they just don't seem to like the idea that people on the right can say what they want to say within the bounds of the law, which is startling.
Yes, it is startling. But you know what it also says to me? It says to me that the legacy media, they don't trust you to make decisions for yourself. They want to narrate what you see and what you hear. They want to keep you in a box. They want to keep you someplace where you're controlled, where all that you hear and all that you see is what they want you to hear and what they want you to see. Friends, that's communism. It's exactly what happens in China. You can't just hear and see and watch anything you want. No. The CCP wants to control what you hear and what you see to keep you from rising up against that communist regime. And that's exactly what's taking place here in America. It's already here. And friends of Kamala Harris and Tampon Tim, communist Tim Walz, if they get in the Oval Office, if they get a chance to run this country, you better kiss the freedoms that you still hold dear goodbye. I have no doubt that they will fast-track this country into the United Socialist States of America and put laws on the books at the federal level and use every federal agency at their disposal to do exactly what they've done to President Donald Trump, to every single American that stands up against them. That should scare the hell out of all of you. Coming up, we've got the latest updates on Israel's retaliatory attack on Iran. We'll bring you everything that we know about it when we come back.
Hi folks, we're back. If you've been injured in an accident that's not your fault and you don't have an attorney, listen up. We have legal professionals standing by to answer your questions and tell you what your case is potentially worth. Pick up the phone, call now.
Heart attacks can happen at any time. If you suffer cardiac arrest outside of a hospital, you have just a 7% chance of surviving.
That's why this world-renowned cardiologist brings you the simple Heart Cure diet and meal plan. Start improving your heart health now with this easy-to-follow program that combines expert advice with hundreds of delicious heart-healthy recipes. See improvements in as little as 28 days. Claim your free copy today. Go online or call the number on your screen.
Hi folks, we're back. If you've been injured in an accident that's not your fault and you don't have an attorney, listen up. We have legal professionals standing by to answer your questions and tell you what your case is potentially worth. Pick up the phone, call now.
Attention, cancer victims who were in New York on or after 9/11. If you or a loved one were in Lower Manhattan during the 9/11 tragedy or during the 11 months afterward, and were later diagnosed with any of these or other cancers, you may be entitled to a substantial settlement. A $10 billion compensation fund is in place for these cancer victims. Do not wait to file your claim. Call now and speak with us. The call is confidential and free, or reach us online at worldtradecenterfund.com.
The 2024 presidential election may be remembered for generations as a testament to resilience and determination. Donald Trump may overcome extreme adversity to win a second term as President of the United States, solidifying his place in history. This historic victory may symbolize a new chapter in American politics, a triumph of vision and perseverance. In honor of the prospect of this momentous event, we present the official 2024 Historic Victory Collection. The Trump Victory Coin, meticulously crafted by skilled American artisans, captures the essence of this historic achievement in stunning detail. On the obverse, you will find the determined visage of potential President Donald Trump, a leader who embodies strength and resolve. The reverse side illustrates his vision for America's future, a future grounded in prosperity and renewed greatness. Each private issue commemorative coin has been minted in exquisite detail to the precise dimensions of the U.S. Liberty Silver dollar and layered in pure .999 silver. The artistry and intricate detail are truly stunning. Each magnificent piece comes with a custom double-sided display case that showcases both sides for preservation and protection for years to come. A signed certificate of authenticity assures its part in this official collection. Republican Red is symbolic of this historic win. The final issue price was to be set at $80. However, during this special release, you can own a piece of the Trump Historic Victory Collection for just $39.99, protected by our 60-day money-back guarantee. These coins have a limited production run and will be shipped on a first-come, first-served basis. There's a strict limit of 3 per order at this price. Also available in 24-karat gold layered. These coins may be sold out after Election Day, so call or click to reserve your piece of history now.
Call 1-800-667-9086 or visit ordertrumpcoin.com. So call 1-800-667-9086 or visit ordertrumpcoin.com now.
Welcome back, friends, to The Pulse. I am David Harris Jr. Well, we have updates on Israel's retaliatory strikes tonight. Syria's state-run news agency reports that Israel struck several military targets in southern and central Syria, in addition to the strikes on Iran that we reported on earlier. Officials say that Israel is not targeting Iranian nuclear facilities or oil fields and is focusing on military targets. We'll bring you more updates on this situation as we get the facts. Stay with us, friends. Silver Lining is next.
Abraham Lincoln began the war between the states with a single stated purpose: to preserve the Union. So it surprised everyone when in July of 1862, President Lincoln announced his intentions to issue an Emancipation Proclamation to free the Southern slaves. Lincoln was urged to delay his proclamation until the Union Army could boast a battlefield victory. That opportunity came at the Battle of Antietam, when Union forces drove Lee's army out of Maryland. 5 days later, on September 22, 1862, President Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, stating slaves in those areas still in rebellion within 100 days will be freed. This action made slavery the focus of the war and ultimately caused France and England to withdraw their support of the South. You're watching An American Moment on Newsmax TV.
Whether because of discomfort, lack of mobility.
Very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they time the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they time the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they time the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they time the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they time the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. Brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they time the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they time the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they time the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they time the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they time the regime has to fight for survival against enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they time the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very, to say the least. Yeah, and they time the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, and they time the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they time the survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they time the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they time the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they time the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they time the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime. Yeah, and they time the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they time the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they time the regime has to fight for survival against internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they time the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they time the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they time the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they time the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they time the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they time the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they time the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they time the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they time the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they time the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they time the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they time the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they time the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they time the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they time the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they time fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time,
payment cuts, and record inflation.
survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime has to fight for survival against its own internal enemies. It is a very brittle regime, to say the least. Yeah, and they come time, the regime.
We can strike your nuclear facilities. We can in Hezbollah in Gaza. So that's why maybe now you need to think better if you want to continue this all war out with Israel all in, or you want to stop now before it will be too late, because Israel now determined to go all the way.
They haven't gone all the way yet. Is that a mystery? I mean, people understand that Israel has that capacity. And I want to emphasize, look, this is just me, but I totally support this. This seems like it's totally necessary, what they have done with Hezbollah and the rest, funding the attacks against Israel, directing them perhaps. I thought Iran, though, knew about Israel's capability. I mean, they have the capability to take out the nuclear facilities, or at least strike them.